I studied the classified folder's contents while Grayson waited, his fingers drumming against the metal table in a rhythm that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. The photographs showed structures that looked like someone had crossed a jellyfish with a tumor, translucent, veined, and absolutely wrong, in ways that made my analytical mind stumble. Lake Thurmond, I said, flipping through satellite images that showed dark patches along the shoreline. These formations just appeared overnight? According to local fishermen, yes. Grayson pulled out a map marked with red circles. 7 sites total, always near water, always accompanied by complete electromagnetic failure within a 2-mile radius. I'd spent enough time analyzing cave networks in Afghanistan to recognize patterns, but this felt different. The structures in these photos weren't built. They looked grown, like something had decided to set up camp and brought its own architecture. You mentioned my underground warfare experience, I said. These things are coming from below? We believe so. Grayson's hands had stopped drumming, which is why we need someone who understands subterranean tactical environments. The briefing room door opened and 2 men entered. The older one moved with the careful precision of someone who'd seen combat, while the younger practically vibrated with nervous energy. Dr. Melvin Ryan, Grayson said, gesturing to the older man, biochemist, former Army medic, 3 tours in Iraq. Ryan nodded without smiling. His dark eyes studied me with clinical interest, like I was a specimen he might need to dissect later. Burn scars covered both his hands, recent ones from the look of them. Agent Lewis Tucker, Grayson continued, fresh from Quantico, top of his class in tactical analysis. Tucker stepped forward, extending his hand with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever. Agent Becker, right? I've read your reports on tunnel systems in Kandahar. Really impressive work. I shook his hand, noting the soft skin and perfect manicure. This kid had never fired a weapon outside a training range. Ryan spread additional photographs across the table. These were taken at the North Carolina site before we lost contact with the team. The images showed the same organic structures, but larger. Much larger. What had been 3-foot formations in the earlier photos now stretched 15 feet across, their surfaces crawling with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. They're growing, I said, rapidly. Ryan's clinical tone made the observations sound like he was discussing plant growth. The material appears to be some kind of biological composite, part organic tissue, part mineral matrix. It's unlike anything in the literature. Tucker leaned over the photos, his face pale. What happened to the previous teams? Grayson closed the folder. That's what you're going to find out. I picked up the liability waiver, scanning the dense legal text. Standard government language about accepting responsibility for injury or death, except for one clause that mentioned exposure to unknown biological agents and potential psychological trauma from encounters with unidentified phenomena. Extraterrestrial phenomena, I said, looking up at Grayson. That's what the mission brief claims. But you're asking for someone trained in underground warfare. The classification protects operational security, Grayson replied, but his eyes shifted away from mine. I signed the papers anyway. After 12 months of analyzing satellite data and writing reports nobody read, I needed to get back in the field, even if the field involved jellyfish tumors and missing teams. Ryan handed me a small device that looked like a modified radio. Electromagnetic interference makes standard communication impossible near the sites. This should work for short-range contact, but don't count on it. Tucker was already suited up in tactical gear that looked fresh from the supply depot. His rifle still had factory oil on the barrel. When do we leave? I asked. Helicopters waiting, Grayson said. You'll insert 2 miles from the target site and approach on foot. Document everything, collect samples if possible, and get out fast. I strapped on my tactical vest, checking the equipment loadout. Standard reconnaissance gear, plus some items I didn't recognize. Devices that looked like modified speakers and ammunition marked with chemical symbols. One more thing, Grayson said as we headed for the door. If you encounter the structures directly, do not attempt to make physical contact. Early reports suggest the material may be reactive. Ryan's scarred hands suddenly made more sense. The helicopter waited on the landing pad, its rotors already spinning. Through the noise, Tucker shouted something about being excited for his first real mission. Ryan climbed aboard without comment, settling into his seat with the calm of someone who'd made this kind of trip before. I took one last look at the briefing facility as we lifted off. Whatever was waiting at Lake Thurmond, it had already claimed 2 teams. The smart move would be to request a transfer back to desk analysis, but I'd spent too many months wondering what I was really capable of in the field. Time to find out. The helicopter's rotors beat against morning fog as I ran through my equipment checklist one last time. Across from me, Lewis fumbled with his rifle's safety, clicking it on and off with the nervous energy of someone who'd never fired a weapon outside Quantico's training range. Dr. Ryan sat motionless beside him, scrolling through data on his tablet like we were heading to a conference instead of whatever waited at Lake Thurmond. 2 miles out, the pilot called back. That's as close as I get. Instruments start going haywire any nearer to those coordinates. I nodded, checking my pack straps. 2 miles meant a decent hike through unknown terrain, but at least we'd approach the target zone on foot instead of announcing our arrival with rotor noise. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing, pine trees pressing close on all sides. Lewis hopped out first, his enthusiasm intact despite the remote location. Ryan followed, already pulling sample containers from his pack before his boots hit the ground. Radio check in 2 hours, I told the pilot. If you don't hear from us by 1400, contact base. The helicopter lifted off, leaving us in sudden silence broken only by wind through the pines. I shouldered my pack and started toward the lake, following the GPS coordinates Grayson had provided. 40 minutes into the hike, I caught the first hint of something wrong. A smell drifted through the trees, sickly sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun, but with an underlying metallic tang that reminded me of blood. Lewis wrinkled his nose. What is that? Keep moving, I said, though the odor made my stomach clench. The smell grew stronger with each step. Ryan pulled out a handheld air quality monitor, frowning at the readings. Elevated methane levels, also detecting organic compounds I can't identify. We pushed deeper into the forest, following what might have been a deer trail. The pine canopy blocked most of the morning sun, leaving us in green-tinted twilight that made everything feel underwater. Then Lewis stopped, so suddenly I nearly walked into him. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Ahead of us, attached to the trunk of a massive oak tree, hung something that made my analytical mind stutter. The photographs from Grayson's briefing hadn't prepared me for the reality of seeing one up close. The structure looked like a tumor made of translucent skin, roughly 4 feet across and bulging with fluid that moved beneath the surface. But it wasn't just attached to the tree. It had somehow merged with the bark, creating raised veins that pulsed with dark liquid. The whole thing breathed, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that had nothing to do with wind. Lewis doubled over and vomited into the undergrowth. Ryan stepped closer, pulling out his camera. Fascinating. The integration with the host organism appears complete. Look at these vascular connections. I studied the thing through my rifle scope, trying to maintain professional distance. The membrane surface showed constant movement underneath, not the slow rippling we'd seen in the satellite photos, but rapid, purposeful motion, like dozens of creatures fighting to get out. How many are in there? Lewis asked, wiping his mouth. Unknown, Ryan said, collecting a sample of the yellow fluid that leaked from the base. Early analysis suggests each structure contains multiple organisms in various developmental stages. I swept my scope across the clearing ahead. My blood went cold as I counted the shapes hanging from trees and growing from the ground. 17 more structures, each one slightly larger than the last. The biggest one, attached to a dead pine at the far edge of the clearing, measured at least 6 feet across. We need to document everything and get out, I said. This is way beyond what the briefing described. Ryan nodded, still focused on his samples. The electromagnetic interference is definitely stronger here. My equipment readings are fluctuating wildly. Our radios confirmed his observation, emitting bursts of static so painful we had to switch them off. I gestured for the team to spread out, using hand signals to coordinate our movement through the clearing. That's when Lewis made his first and last tactical mistake. I could only guess what made him do it: nerves, inexperience, or the overwhelming wrongness of what we were seeing. But as we approached the nearest structure, Lewis raised his rifle and fired 3 rounds directly into the membrane. The thing exploded. Yellow fluid sprayed across the clearing as the membrane tore open, releasing a mass of segmented creatures that looked like oversized worms. Each one stretched about as long as my forearm, their bodies covered in tiny hooks that caught the light like fish scales. But these weren't sluggish parasites. They moved with terrifying speed, their hook-covered bodies letting them climb any surface: tree bark, rocks, even the vertical face of Lewis's tactical vest as the first wave reached him. Changed from describing Lewis's internal state, frozen, to observable behavior, didn't move. Keeping within Robin's perspective, the things reached him in seconds. Lewis screamed as the first creature latched onto his boot, its hooks tearing through the leather like paper. More swarmed up his legs, their segmented bodies writhing as they climbed higher. He tried to brush them off, but they moved too fast, too many at once. "Lewis!" I raised my rifle, but couldn't get a clear shot without hitting him. He stumbled backward, still screaming, as the creatures reached his torso. I watched in horror as one of them found the gap between his vest and collar, disappearing beneath the fabric. Lewis's scream cut off abruptly, his eyes going wide with shock. Then he collapsed. Ryan grabbed my arm. "We have to go. Now!" I took one last look at Lewis's motionless form, covered in the writhing mass of creatures, then turned and ran. The sound of more membranes bursting echoed behind us as we crashed through the undergrowth, heading back toward the extraction point. The creatures hit Lewis like a living wave. I screamed at him to move, to run, to do something other than stand there like a deer in headlights, but my voice couldn't reach him. He just stood there, motionless. The first worm latched onto his boot, its hooks shredding the leather in seconds. Then another grabbed his calf, and another, their segmented bodies writhing as they climbed higher. I raised my rifle and opened fire, the automatic burst cutting through dozens of the things. Yellow fluid sprayed across the clearing as bodies exploded under the impact, but more kept pouring from the ruptured membrane. Had to be 50 of them, maybe more, all moving with that horrible, coordinated purpose. Lewis finally found his voice, but by then it was too late. His screams echoed through the trees as the creatures reached his torso, some finding gaps in his tactical vest, others simply chewing through the fabric with those razor-sharp hooks. I watched one disappear into his collar, its body creating a visible bulge as it moved beneath his skin. "Lewis!" I fired again, trying to clear a path to him, but the swarm had him surrounded. His screams turned to wet gurgles as several worms forced their way into his mouth. I could see them moving under his skin, creating ripples across his throat and cheeks as they burrowed deeper. His eyes went wide with shock and pain, bulging as pressure built behind them. Ryan grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "We have to go. Now!" I looked past him and felt my blood turn to ice. Throughout the clearing, the other membranes were starting to rupture on their own, responding to some signal I couldn't detect. Yellow fluid leaked from expanding cracks as more structures prepared to release their contents. "I'm not leaving him." I shook off Ryan's grip and started toward Lewis, but the scientist yanked me back with surprising strength. "He's gone." Ryan pulled an incendiary grenade from his vest. "Look at him." Through the swarm, I caught a glimpse of Lewis's motionless form behind the fallen log where he'd collapsed. The memory of his final moments flashed through my mind, his body convulsing as something pushed against his eyes from the inside, making them bulge grotesquely. Dark shapes had writhed beneath the skin of his face and neck. Ryan armed the grenade and hurled it between us and the swarm. The explosion created a wall of white-hot flame that sent the creatures scrambling backward, their clicking sounds rising to a shriek as they encountered the heat. But fire only bought us seconds. Already I could see them finding ways around the burning barrier, their bodies glistening as they moved through the undergrowth on either side of the flames. The image burned in my memory. Lewis's eyes staring at nothing, blood trickling from his nose and ears. Whatever those things had done to him, it was over. "Move!" Ryan shoved me toward the tree line. Every instinct I'd developed in 12 years of military service screamed at me to recover Lewis's body, to never leave a man behind. But as I watched, more membranes burst throughout the clearing, releasing fresh waves of creatures. I knew staying meant joining him. I turned and ran. The clicking sounds followed us through the forest, growing louder as more nests ruptured behind us. Our boots crashed through undergrowth while that horrible chittering echoed from every direction, like insects the size of house cats communicating in a language made of razor blades. Ryan moved faster than I'd expected for a man his age, his medical training probably giving him a clearer understanding of exactly what those things would do if they caught us. He led us along what might have been a game trail, weaving between pine trees while the clicking sounds grew closer. My radio crackled with static as we ran, the electromagnetic interference making communication impossible, but I could hear the helicopter's rotors in the distance, still waiting at the extraction point. We broke through the tree line just as the first creatures emerged from the forest behind us. The pilot saw us coming and spun up the engines, the rotor wash kicking up clouds of pine needles and dirt. I dove into the cargo hold as Ryan scrambled up behind me. Through the open door, I could see the swarm spreading across the clearing like spilled oil, hundreds of segmented bodies reflecting the morning sun. "Go!" I shouted to the pilot. The helicopter lifted off just as the first creatures reached the landing zone. Several worms launched themselves at the aircraft, their hooks catching on the landing gear before the altitude and rotor wash finally shook them loose. I watched them fall back to earth as we climbed, their bodies twisting in the air before disappearing into the forest canopy. Ryan slumped against the cargo hold wall, his face pale and slick with sweat. "The samples," he said, checking his pack. "At least we got samples." I stared down at the forest as we flew away, thinking about Lewis's face in those final moments. 24 years old, fresh from Quantico, dead because he'd panicked and fired into something he didn't understand. The mission briefing hadn't prepared us for this. Grayson's carefully worded reports about unknown biological entities hadn't captured the reality of watching those things move with purpose, responding to signals, coordinating their attacks like a military unit. This wasn't some random infestation we could contain with standard protocols. This was war, and we'd just lost the opening battle. I spent 3 weeks locked in what the agency called a medical observation facility. Basically a sterile prison where they drew blood twice daily and monitored my vitals for signs of parasitic infection. Every time I closed my eyes, Lewis's final moments played on repeat, his face contorting as those things burrowed under his skin, the wet sounds they made chewing through him from the inside. The nightmares were bad enough, but the waiting was worse. 21 days of sitting in a white room while doctors ran tests I didn't understand, checking for contamination that might not show up for weeks. The only breaks came when Dr. Ryan visited with updates I didn't want to hear. "Field analysis results," he said during his second visit, spreading photographs across my bedside table with clinical detachment. Based on video footage and similar cases, the organisms likely consumed approximately 40% of Agent Tucker's internal organs in under 3 minutes. I pushed the photos away without looking. How? They secrete a powerful digestive enzyme, essentially liquefies tissue on contact. Ryan's scarred hands shuffled through additional images. Video analysis shows 17 separate entry points, but the attack patterns suggest coordinated feeding behavior. The third week dragged by with no word from anyone. I'd started wondering if they planned to keep me here indefinitely when Grayson walked through the door, carrying a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Your quarantine's being cut short," he said, settling into the plastic visitor's chair. "We need you back in the field." I sat up straighter, suddenly alert. "The blood work came back clean?" "Clean enough." Grayson opened the folder, revealing satellite images of new nest sites. 7 confirmed breeding locations across 3 states. The situation is escalating faster than we anticipated. The photographs showed the same organic structures we'd encountered at Lake Thurmond, but larger, much larger. One image captured a formation that had to be 20 feet across, its translucent surface crawling with movement. "Where's the team I'm supposed to lead?" I asked. Being assembled as we speak, 2 new agents, both former Army Rangers, plus Dr. Ryan will continue providing scientific support. I studied the satellite images, noting how the nests clustered near water sources. What happened to containment protocols? I thought the plan was to monitor and study these things. Grayson's expression hardened. 3 families in Tennessee, dead because nests formed too close to residential areas. The creatures are becoming more aggressive, establishing breeding sites closer to populated zones. He pulled out additional photos that made my stomach clench. A farmhouse with its windows blown out from the inside, yellow fluid coating the walls. Emergency responders in hazmat suits loading body bags into a truck. The Henderson family, Grayson continued. Parents and 2 children. Neighbors reported strange sounds from their barn for 3 days before contact was lost. I set the photos aside, my hands shaking slightly. "How many teams are running operations like this?" "Classified." Grayson closed the folder. "But I can tell you, we've recruited 24 new agents in the past month. Half have already requested transfers after their first encounters. The smart move would be to join them, request a transfer back to analysis, spend my days studying satellite data instead of facing those things in person. But Lewis's death had left something unfinished, a debt I couldn't walk away from. When do I start?" "Tomorrow." Grayson stood, leaving the folder on my bedside table. "Dr. Ryan will brief you on new equipment developments. We've made some progress understanding their weaknesses." After he left, I flipped through the mission files. The new team members looked competent enough. Trevor Coleman and Zayden Hoffman, both with multiple combat deployments and solid performance records. But competence hadn't saved Lewis from making a fatal mistake when panic took over. Dr. Ryan appeared an hour later, wheeling in a cart loaded with equipment I didn't recognize. "Thought you should see what we've developed." He lifted a device that looked like a modified flamethrower, its fuel tank marked with chemical symbols. "White phosphorus delivery system. Attaches to your standard rifle mount. Burns hot enough to kill them? Burns hot enough to melt steel." Ryan demonstrated the attachment mechanism. "We've also developed specialized ammunition." He showed me rounds filled with what looked like blue powder. Copper sulfate solution, appears to be toxic to their unique biochemistry, though we're still studying the mechanism. I hefted one of the rounds, noting its unusual weight. "How toxic?" "Lethal within 30 seconds of exposure, based on laboratory testing." Ryan's clinical tone made it sound like he was discussing weather patterns. "The challenge is achieving accurate delivery under field conditions." He pulled out additional equipment, reinforced tactical gear, modified radio systems, and what looked like a small speaker array. "Sound weapons? Still experimental. We've observed that certain frequencies cause behavioral changes in captured specimens." Ryan packed everything back onto the cart. "Your new team will help field test these developments." That night, I lay awake thinking about Lewis's enthusiasm during that helicopter ride to Lake Thurmond. He'd been so eager to prove himself, so confident that his training had prepared him for anything. The memory of his voice, really impressive work, echoed in my mind as I stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow I'd meet 2 new agents who probably felt the same way Lewis had. Young, trained, ready to follow orders into situations their instructors had never imagined. My job was to keep them alive long enough to learn what we were really fighting. The folder sat on my nightstand, filled with photographs of nests that kept growing larger and families that hadn't survived the encounter. Whatever these things were, wherever they'd come from, they weren't going away. Time to get back to work. I pushed through the lab's heavy steel door and immediately regretted breathing through my nose. The smell hit me first. Formaldehyde mixed with something rotten and metallic that made my eyes water, but it was the sight that really got to me. Melvin stood in the center of the room, surrounded by glass jars filled with cloudy preservative fluid. Inside each one, pieces of segmented worm floated like some demented science fair project. The worst part? They were still moving, not the slow drift you'd expect from dead tissue, but actual twitching, like they were trying to reassemble themselves. Jesus, Melvin. I stepped closer to one of the larger specimens' jars. How long have they been dead? Define dead. He didn't look up from the device he was adjusting on his workbench. Cardiovascular function ceased 72 hours ago, but neural activity continues in isolated segments. The 3rd week had just begun with no word from anyone. I'd started wondering if they planned to keep me here indefinitely when Grayson walked through the door carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone delivering bad news. I jerked back instinctively. That's not possible. Tell that to them. Melvin finally turned around, holding what looked like an industrial speaker crossed with a ray gun. Burn scars covered both his hands. The ones I'd noticed during our Lake Thurmond debriefing looked even worse now. But I think I've found something that actually works. He aimed the device at the nearest specimen jar and pulled the trigger. The sound that emerged made my teeth ache. A high-pitched whine just at the edge of hearing. Inside the jar, the worm segment went rigid. Its constant writhing stopped completely. 40 kilohertz, Melvin said, watching the motionless specimen with satisfaction. Scrambles their bioelectric nervous system. 90 seconds of complete paralysis. I studied the frozen worm, noting how its body had locked into an almost perfect straight line. How'd you figure this out? Accident. He set the device down and pulled off his safety glasses. Had a live specimen in the MRI chamber for brain imaging. Machine started its sequence, and the thing just seized up. I'd been locked in what the agency called a medical observation facility for nearly 3 weeks, basically a sterile prison where they drew blood twice daily and monitored my vitals for signs of parasitic infection. The specimen in the jar began twitching again, slowly at first, then with increasing violence. Within seconds, it was moving normally, pressing against the glass like it was trying to get out. Only 90 seconds? Unfortunately. Melvin picked up the device again. He'd labeled it Sonic Disruptor in neat block letters. But that's 90 seconds where they can't move, can't attack, can't do anything except wait for the effect to wear off. I walked around his workstation, counting the specimen jars. 17 in total, each containing different body segments. Where'd you get all these? The Virginia site. Advanced team managed to collect samples before the nest went active. His clinical tone couldn't quite hide the exhaustion in his voice. Lost 2 agents in the process. The burns on his hands suddenly made sense. What happened to you? Melvin flexed his fingers, the scar tissue pulling tight. Early testing phase. Had a live specimen in a reinforced chamber, thought the glass was thick enough. He gestured to a corner of the lab where black scorch marks covered the floor and walls. Thing broke free when I got too close. Had to use a blowtorch to kill it. I examined the sonic disruptor more closely. The device was roughly the size of a submachine gun with a battery pack that looked heavy enough to throw off your aim. Range? 30 meters in open air, less in enclosed spaces. Melvin demonstrated the controls. Simple trigger mechanism with a frequency dial. Battery lasts 6 hours of continuous operation. And it works on all of them? So far. But his hesitation told me there was more to it. Though I've noticed something troubling in repeated exposures. He led me to another workstation where a single specimen floated in a smaller tank. This one looked different, larger than the others, with darker coloration along its segmented body. This one's been exposed to the frequency 12 times over the past week. Melvin aimed the disruptor and fired. The worm froze for maybe 30 seconds before resuming its movement. They're adapting, learning to resist the effect. How fast? Each exposure reduces effectiveness by approximately 8%. He made a note on his clipboard with the mechanical precision of someone who'd been working 18-hour days. I've been adjusting frequencies to compensate, but there's a limit to how much variation the device can produce. The lab door opened behind us, and Grayson walked in carrying a manila folder thick enough to stop bullets. His face showed the strain of someone who'd been getting too many reports like the one he was about to deliver. Kentucky situation's escalated, he said without preamble. Aerial surveillance confirms the barn structure has tripled in size since yesterday. He spread photographs across Melvin's workbench. The images showed a farm from above, but the barn looked wrong, bulging outward like something massive was pressing against the walls from inside. Yellow fluid stained the ground around the building's perimeter. Henderson family called emergency services 3 days ago, reported strange noises from their livestock barn. Grayson pointed to the farmhouse, which looked intact but showed no signs of activity. Phone line went dead before responders could arrive. I studied the thermal imaging shots. The barn showed up as one enormous heat bloom, while the farmhouse displayed 4 distinct signatures that could be human body heat. Families still alive? Possibly, but not for long if that nest reaches maturity. Grayson pulled out additional images showing the barn's interior through what looked like fiber optic cameras. Structure appears to have consumed the entire 40 by 60 foot space. We're looking at something unprecedented. The interior shots made my stomach clench. What had once been a working barn was now a cathedral of organic architecture, pulsing membranes stretching from floor to ceiling. At the center, something large was suspended in translucent webbing, probably a cow based on the size, though it was hard to tell with all the feeding activity around it. Team composition? I asked. You'll lead. Dr. Ryan provides scientific support and field testing for the sonic device. Grayson consulted his folder. Plus 2 new agents, Trevor Coleman and Zayden Hoffman, both former Army Rangers, multiple combat deployments. Combat experience with conventional enemies, I pointed out. This is different. They'll learn fast or they won't survive. Grayson's blunt assessment carried the weight of too many casualty reports. Transport leaves in 4 hours. Full tactical loadout plus Dr. Ryan's new equipment. Melvin was already packing the sonic disruptor into a reinforced case, along with spare batteries and what looked like portable speakers. I'll bring backup frequency generators. If the primary device fails, we'll need alternatives. I picked up one of the Kentucky photos, studying the barn's distorted walls. Whatever was inside had grown large enough to reshape the building's structure. The thought of Lewis's final moments flashed through my mind. Those things had been small enough to crawl under his skin. What could they become when they had room to grow? Rules of engagement? I asked. Contain and eliminate. No survivors among the creatures, minimal structural damage to preserve evidence. Grayson closed his folder, and get the Henderson family out if possible. As he left, I turned back to Melvin's specimen jars. The worms continued their endless writhing, pressing against the glass like they could sense my presence. In a few hours, I'd be facing hundreds of them in their natural habitat, armed with an experimental weapon that worked for 90 seconds at a time. "Any other weaknesses I should know about?" I asked Melvin. He was cleaning his equipment with the methodical care of someone who'd learned not to take chances. "Fireworks, but you have to burn them completely. Cutting them apart just creates more mobile pieces." He gestured to his specimen collection, and they seemed to communicate through bioelectric signals, so disrupting one affects others nearby. "How many others?" "Unknown, but the sonic pulse appears to propagate through their shared nervous network." Melvin sealed the last equipment case. "In theory, hitting one creature with the disruptor should paralyze everything within a 30-meter radius." In theory. I'd learned not to trust theories when it came to these things. They had a habit of behaving in ways that made textbooks useless. 4 hours to brief 2 new agents who thought they understood combat. 4 hours to prepare for something that had turned a working farm into a nightmare of organic architecture. I looked at the specimen jars one more time, watching those segmented bodies twist and writhe with alien purpose. Whatever we found in Kentucky, it wouldn't be anything the Rangers had trained for. Time to see if Melvin's frequency weapon worked as well in the field as it did in the lab. Through thermal imaging, Robin spotted 4 human heat signatures inside the farmhouse. The Henderson family, who neighbors reported had been experiencing strange activity before losing contact. I crouched behind the tree line with my binoculars, studying the barn that no longer looked like any structure built by human hands. The wooden walls bulged outward like a balloon ready to burst. The boards warped and split where something massive pressed against them from inside. "Christ," Trevor muttered beside me. "What the hell is in there?" Through my scope, I could see yellow fluid seeping through gaps in the wood, pooling in dark stains around the building's foundation. The entire structure seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. "Thermals showing one massive heat signature," Zayden reported, checking his scanner. "Whatever's in there has filled the whole space." I switched to thermal imaging and immediately wished I hadn't. The barn showed up as a single pulsing blob of heat that stretched from wall to wall. 40 by 60 feet of something alive and growing. "Farmhouse?" I asked. 4 signatures, human-sized, stationary. Zayden adjusted the scanner's sensitivity. 2nd floor, clustered together in what looks like a bedroom. The Henderson family. Still alive, but trapped in their own home while something from hell set up shop in their barn. Melvin crouched 20 feet behind us, making final adjustments to the sonic disruptor. The device had been modified since our lab demonstration. Now it looked like a backpack-mounted system with speakers that could be aimed independently. The high-pitched whine was barely audible, just at the edge of human hearing, but it made my teeth ache. "Range test complete," Melvin called softly. "Effective radius confirmed at 30 meters. I studied the farm's layout through my binoculars. The farmhouse sat about 50 yards from the barn, connected by a gravel driveway. Between us and the buildings stretched an open field with no cover except a rusted tractor that had seen better decades. "Coleman, take Hoffman and secure the farmhouse," I decided. "Get the family out and establish a perimeter. Ryan and I will handle the barn." Trevor nodded, checking his rifle one more time. The copper sulfate rounds Melvin had developed looked ordinary enough, but they'd punched through worm carapaces like armor-piercing ammunition in our tests. "What if the nest goes active while we're separated?" Zayden asked. "Good question." The thermal readings suggested whatever was in that barn was still in development phase, but our intelligence on creature behavior remained frustratingly incomplete. "Maintain radio contact," I said. "If things go sideways, fall back to the extraction point." Trevor and Zayden moved out, using the morning shadows to approach the farmhouse from the north side. I watched them through my scope until they reached the building's cover, then turned my attention back to the barn. The structure looked even worse up close. What had once been solid wooden walls now sagged outward like fabric stretched over something too large for the space. Yellow fluid leaked steadily from every joint and seam, creating dark stains that spread across the ground in patterns that reminded me of root systems. "Biochemical analysis?" I asked Melvin. He pulled out a handheld scanner, pointing it toward the barn. "Elevated methane, hydrogen sulfide, and organic compounds I can't identify. Whatever's producing this is metabolically active on a massive scale." The barn door had been sealed shut by the same organic material we'd seen at the nest sites, a translucent membrane that pulsed with dark veins. No way we were getting through that without making noise. I pulled thermite charges from my pack, the white-hot incendiary that could burn through steel. "Stand back." The charges went off with a brilliant flash, melting through the door frame and sending the organic seal curling away like burning plastic. The smell that poured out made me gag. Sweet rot mixed with something chemical that burned my nostrils. But it was the sight inside that really got to me. The barn's interior had been completely transformed. Where there should have been farm equipment and hay bales, organic architecture stretched from floor to ceiling like the inside of some massive organism. Pulsing membranes formed cathedral arches that reached the 30-foot roof, while veins of dark fluid ran along surfaces that looked more grown than built. At the center, suspended in translucent webbing 20 feet off the ground, hung what had once been a cow. The carcass was barely recognizable now, wrapped in feeding tubes that pulsed as they drained its fluids. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the movement. Thousands of segmented worms covered every surface, their bodies writhing in coordinated waves as they fed on the organic structure itself. They ranged in size from the forearm-length creatures we'd encountered before to new variants that stretched 6 feet or more, their carapaces gleaming with that same yellow fluid. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. Melvin stepped up beside me, his scanner going crazy as it tried to process the readings. Biomass estimates suggest over 2 tons of active organism. This isn't just a nest, it's a processing facility. The worms had noticed us. Hundreds of segmented heads turned in our direction, and I could hear their clicking communication growing louder. In seconds, they'd start moving toward the entrance. "Hit them," I told Melvin. The sonic disruptor fired with a sound that made my bones ache. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Every worm in the structure froze mid-motion, their bodies locking into rigid lines as the ultrasonic pulse scrambled their nervous systems. 90 seconds. That's all we had. I sprinted into the barn, pulling white phosphorus grenades from my tactical vest. The frozen worms created a surreal landscape of motionless serpents, their bodies forming bridges and walkways throughout the organic architecture. I planted charges at the base of the major support structures, working as fast as my hands could move. Melvin followed behind me, pouring accelerant over the larger worm clusters. The chemical would help the phosphorus burn hot enough to destroy everything, leaving nothing that could regenerate. 60 seconds, he called. The suspended cow carcass hung directly above us. Its body cavity opened like a flower to reveal the feeding apparatus inside. Tubes and tendrils connected it to the surrounding structure, creating a distribution network that probably fed the entire nest. I climbed the organic scaffolding, my boots slipping on surfaces that felt disturbingly warm and soft. At the top, I planted my last charge directly against the feeding apparatus. 30 seconds! We ran for the entrance as the first worms began to twitch, their paralysis wearing off. Behind us, clicking sounds rose to a shriek as thousands of creatures started moving toward our position. My radio crackled with Trevor's voice. "Farmhouse secure, families alive but catatonic. Fall back to extraction," I shouted as we cleared the barn entrance. The white phosphorus charges went off in sequence, each explosion sending pillars of brilliant flame through the organic structure. The worms' shrieks rose to an inhuman wail as the fire consumed everything, creatures, architecture, and the twisted amalgamation of barn and nest. Within minutes, the entire building was a pillar of white flame that could probably be seen from orbit. The heat was so intense we had to retreat another 100 yards. watching through our scopes as the fire consumed every trace of the infestation. Trevor and Zayden emerged from the farmhouse carrying the Henderson family, a middle-aged couple and two teenagers who stared at nothing with the blank expressions of people who'd seen too much. They were alive, but something in their eyes suggested they might never fully recover from whatever they'd witnessed. Medical teams en route, Trevor reported. ETA 15 minutes. I looked back at the burning barn, watching the flames climb toward the morning sky. Another nest destroyed, another family saved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were fighting a losing battle. For every structure we eliminated, how many more were growing in places we hadn't found yet? The Henderson farm would be written up as a gas explosion. The family would receive trauma counseling and financial compensation, though they'd never be able to talk about what really happened. And somewhere else, probably within 100 miles of here, another nest was already beginning to form. Melvin packed up the sonic disruptor, his movements efficient despite the exhaustion showing in his face. Device performed within parameters. 90-second window was sufficient for tactical objectives. Any signs of adaptation? Too early to tell, but the larger specimens seemed to recover faster than expected. He sealed the equipment case. We may need to adjust frequencies sooner than anticipated. The medical helicopter appeared on the horizon, coming to collect the Henderson family and transport them to a facility that specialized in treating exposure to classified phenomena. They'd spend weeks in observation, just like I had after losing Lewis. But they'd survived. That had to count for something. I sat across from Grayson's desk, my hands folded to keep them from shaking with anger. 48 hours since Kentucky, and I still didn't have answers to the questions that mattered. You keep sending us into these situations blind, I said. 8 months of field operations, and I still don't know what we're really fighting. Grayson leaned back in his chair, studying me with the expression of someone weighing classified information against operational necessity. His fingers drummed against the desk. That same rhythm I'd noticed during my first briefing. Intelligence is compartmentalized for security reasons. Bullshit. I leaned forward. Lewis died because we didn't understand what we were walking into. The Henderson family almost died because we're reacting instead of planning. I need to know what these things actually are. The drumming stopped. Grayson stared at me for a long moment, then stood and walked to a floor safe hidden behind his filing cabinet. The combination took him 30 seconds to input, a sign that whatever was inside rarely saw daylight. He pulled out a thick manila folder marked with security classifications I'd never seen before, then set it on the desk between us. "This doesn't leave this room," he said, "and after you read it, you'll understand why we keep field operatives on a need-to-know basis." I opened the folder and immediately felt my worldview shift. The first page contained geological surveys from 1953, showing cavern systems that stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the Nevada desert. Cross-section diagrams revealed chambers large enough to hold entire cities, connected by tunnels that looked like subway maps drawn by something that had never seen the surface. "How deep?" I asked. "The deepest confirmed chambers are at 12,000 feet. Seismic data suggests they go much further." Grayson pulled out additional maps showing similar systems beneath the Appalachians, the Rockies, and the Pacific Northwest. "We're looking at a network that spans the entire continent." I flipped to the next section and stopped breathing. Photographs showed cave paintings from Nevada, primitive humans wielding spears and torches against segmented creatures emerging from cracks in stone. The artwork was crude, but unmistakable. Worms the size of tree trunks, their bodies covered in the same hooks we'd encountered. "Carbon dating?" I asked. 12,000 years. Grayson sat back down. "The creatures aren't extraterrestrial, Robin. They're terrestrial. They've been here longer than human civilization. These things hadn't invaded Earth. They'd been here first. We were the invaders, building our cities above their territory without knowing what lived beneath our feet. I turned the page and found photographs that made Kentucky look like a minor infestation. Deep cavern chambers filled with organic architecture that stretched beyond the reach of floodlights. Structures that looked like the barn nest magnified 1,000 times, with creatures moving through them that dwarfed anything we'd encountered on the surface. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "How big do they get?" Reconnaissance teams have reported organisms the size of automobiles in the deeper chambers. Grayson's clinical tone couldn't mask the strain in his voice. "The worms you've been fighting are juveniles, first-stage organisms that establish surface breeding sites." I stared at a photograph showing something that looked like a segmented whale, its body filling a cavern tunnel that had to be 30 feet across. Dark eyes the size of dinner plates reflected the camera flash, and I could see intelligence in them that made my skin crawl. "How long have you known?" "The government's been aware since 1962. Project Mahole, a deep drilling initiative designed to reach the Earth's mantle." Grayson pulled out additional files showing drilling equipment and what looked like a mining disaster. "They broke through a nest chamber at 8,000 feet. 14 workers died before they could seal the breach." The Mahole photographs showed a drilling platform that had been torn apart from below. Emergency response teams in hazmat suits loading body bags while yellow fluid pooled around the wreckage. The official report blamed equipment failure, but the classified addendum told a different story. Underground nuclear testing in Nevada during the 50s collapsed several deep cavern systems, Grayson continued. Forced the creatures to seek new habitats closer to the surface. That's when surface encounters began. I found myself thinking about Lewis's enthusiasm during that helicopter ride to Lake Thurmond. If he'd known what we were really facing, not some isolated biological anomaly, but the advanced scouts of something that had ruled the deep earth for millions of years, would he still have volunteered? "How many nest sites?" I asked. Grayson spread a map across his desk, marked with red dots that covered most of North America. I counted quickly, then stopped when I reached 100. "Over 300 confirmed locations," he said. New ones appearing weekly as they establish breeding grounds closer to population centers. The map showed clusters around major cities: Chicago, Atlanta, Denver. Each red dot represented a potential disaster like the Henderson farm, but most were in areas where discovery would mean civilian casualties on a massive scale. Response teams? 43 active units. Your team is performing above average. 8 successful containments with minimal casualties. Grayson's praise felt hollow given what I was learning. Most teams lose half their personnel within 6 months. I did the math. 43 teams against 300 known sites, with new nests forming faster than we could eliminate them. We weren't fighting a war. We were trying to bail out a sinking ship with a coffee cup. "What's the end game?" I asked. "Are we actually trying to win this or just slow them down?" Grayson's silence answered my question. He gathered the photographs and maps, returning them to the folder with the mechanical precision of someone who'd had this conversation before. "Similar containment operations are running across 17 states," he said finally. "Budget allocation suggests the program will continue indefinitely." Indefinitely. Not until victory. Not until the threat was eliminated. Just until the money ran out or the casualties became politically unacceptable. I thought about the Henderson family, sitting in that farmhouse while something from the deep earth set up shop in their barn. They'd survived because we'd arrived in time. But how many other families wouldn't be so lucky? "The recruits I'm supposed to train," I said. "Do they know what they're signing up for?" "They know what they need to know." Grayson locked the folder back in his safe. "Same as you did when you started." I stood to leave, my mind reeling with the scope of what we were facing. Millions of years of evolution in the deep chambers, creatures that had developed in an environment we could barely imagine, now pushing toward the surface as their ancient territory was disrupted by human activity. At the door, I turned back. The cave paintings in Nevada. What happened to those people? Grayson looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. Archaeological evidence suggests their civilization ended abruptly. No survivors, no migration patterns. Just empty settlements and artwork showing their final battle. I walked back to my quarters thinking about those primitive humans, armed with stone weapons and torches, facing creatures they couldn't understand or defeat. 12,000 years later, we had sonic disruptors and white phosphorus grenades, but the fundamental equation remained the same. We were still fighting something older, larger, and better adapted to this planet than we were. The only difference was that now, we knew we were losing. I stood before 22 new recruits at the agency's training facility, watching their faces cycle through the same emotions I'd felt 14 months ago when Grayson first showed me those satellite images. Skepticism, curiosity, and underneath it all, the creeping fear that comes from realizing the world isn't what you thought it was. Agent Lewis Tucker, I said, clicking to the first slide. 24 years old, top of his class at Quantico, dead within 3 minutes of his first creature encounter. The autopsy photos filled the projection screen, clinical documentation of what those things could do to human tissue. Several recruits shifted in their seats. One woman in the back row went pale and looked away. 17 separate entry points, I continued, using a laser pointer to highlight the damage. The organisms secrete digestive enzymes that liquefy internal organs on contact. Agent Tucker remained conscious for approximately 90 seconds while they consumed 40% of his body mass. A young man in the front row raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do we know the timeline if there were no survivors?" "Video footage from his helmet camera." I clicked to the next slide, showing frame-by-frame stills of Lewis's final moments. "We record everything now, for training purposes." The room went quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. These recruits looked competent enough. Military backgrounds, law enforcement experience, the kind of people who thought they'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. But none of them had watched a colleague disappear into a writhing mass of segmented nightmares. I moved to the equipment table and picked up the latest version of Melvin's sonic disruptor. The device had evolved since Kentucky. Now it was built into tactical helmets that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Dr. Ryan's frequency weapon, version 4.7. I demonstrated the helmet's controls, noting how the recruits leaned forward with interest. Creates a protective bubble of ultrasonic interference with a 15-meter radius. Paralyzes creatures for 90 seconds, but they're adapting faster than we can adjust frequencies. I pulled out one of the specialized rounds Melvin had developed, its blue-tinted tip catching the fluorescent lights. Copper sulfate solution, toxic to their unique biochemistry, lethal within 30 seconds of exposure, assuming you can achieve accurate delivery while something the size of a python is trying to burrow into your chest cavity. A recruit in the third row, former Marine based on his posture, spoke up. "What's our success rate?" Good question. I thought about the classified reports I'd been reading, the casualty statistics that kept climbing despite our improved equipment. Depends how you define success. We've eliminated 47 confirmed nest sites in the past year. Lost 63 operatives in the process. I let those numbers sink in. If you're asking whether we're winning this war, the answer is no. We're buying time. I clicked to the next slide, showing thermal imaging of underground formations. We've learned to identify pre-emergent sites by monitoring groundwater temperature increases and methane spikes. Allows us to arrive before nests fully form, when the creatures are still vulnerable. The thermal maps painted a disturbing picture. Hotspots appearing across 17 states, each one representing a potential disaster, like the Henderson Farm. We'd gotten better at finding them early, but they kept appearing faster than we could respond. Intelligence indicates the creatures operate on hibernation cycles, I continued. Activity peaks every 17 years, matching underground thermal changes. We're currently in year 14 of the current cycle. That got their attention. Several recruits exchanged glances, probably doing the math. 3 more years of escalating encounters before the next dormancy period, assuming our intelligence was correct. I moved to a map showing team deployments across the country. Agent Trevor Coleman leads Response Team 7. 14 successful missions, 3 fingers lost to worm bites. I pointed to another marker. Agent Zayden Hoffman commands Team 12. Also, 14 missions, chronic insomnia from repeated exposure trauma. Both men had started as recruits just like these, eager to prove themselves against an enemy they didn't understand. Now they were seasoned veterans who'd learned to function despite the psychological toll of fighting something that shouldn't exist. The President has authorized Operation Deep Guard, I said, clicking to classified schematics. Mapping and sealing major cavern systems using specialized concrete that incorporates copper mesh and ultrasonic emitters. The engineering diagrams showed ambitious plans, deep drilling operations designed to pump thousands of tons of toxic concrete into the underground networks. On paper, it looked like a comprehensive solution. In reality, we were trying to seal tunnels that stretched for thousands of miles with equipment that could barely penetrate a few hundred feet. I thought about the intelligence briefing Grayson had given me 6 months ago. The photographs of creatures the size of automobiles moving through caverns we couldn't reach. Deep Guard was impressive, but it was also a band-aid on a wound that went to the bone. With all this progress, I said, watching their faces, you need to understand what we're really fighting. Seismic data suggests millions more creatures remain in the deep chambers. Climate change is warming underground water tables, potentially triggering mass emergence events. The room stayed silent, but I could see the realization dawning. We weren't pest control operators dealing with an infestation. We were the last line of defense against something that had ruled the deep earth for millions of years and was now pushing toward the surface. I clicked off the projector and faced them directly. Each of you has 24 hours to decide whether to join this fight. There will be no public recognition, no medals, no guarantee of survival, just the knowledge that you stand between humanity and an old enemy that took back the earth once before. A woman in the second row raised her hand. Ma'am, what happened to that earlier civilization? I thought about the cave paintings from Nevada, those primitive humans with their stone spears facing creatures they couldn't defeat. Archaeological evidence suggested their settlements had simply vanished. No migration patterns, no survivors, just empty ruins and artwork showing their final battle. They lost, I said simply. The recruits filed out in small groups, their conversations hushed as they processed what they'd learned. Some would request transfers by morning, choosing safer assignments that didn't involve fighting nightmares in the dark. Others would stay, driven by duty or curiosity or the simple inability to walk away from a threat this large. I packed up the equipment, thinking about Lewis's enthusiasm during that helicopter ride to Lake Thurmond. He'd believed his training had prepared him for anything, right up until those things started climbing his legs. These new recruits looked just as confident, just as ready to prove themselves. In 24 hours, I'd find out which ones were brave enough, or foolish enough, to volunteer for a war we probably couldn't win. But someone had to fight it anyway. Because the alternative was letting those things reach the surface unopposed, and I'd seen what happened to families who found themselves in their path. I turned off the lights and headed for my quarters, leaving the recruits to make the most important decision of their lives. Tomorrow, we'd start training the ones who stayed, teaching them to survive in a world where the monsters were real and they'd been living under our feet all along.